What up, TTK Potters? Welcome back to the program. I'm your host, Sky Guas, joined by my man, Bobby Lamarco. We are continuing our mini-series of wide receivers, and this time we're talking about busts and how to avoid busts in fantasy football for 2022, especially the big names. Today, we're breaking down Calvin Ridley, obviously a sore subject for me as he was a top 5 guy for me and pretty much everyone else, but I had a dark horse number 1 overall wide receiver spot for Calvin Ridley last year. Obviously, wishing him the best in his personal life. He might get traded, could be released. They might keep him on Atlanta. We don't know those answers yet, but we are going to talk about what happened to give us the high hopes on Calvin Ridley last year coming into drafts, what he did while he did play those 5 games, and then what might we can expect this year if he does stay on the Atlanta Falcons. Of course, we'll bring you everything else if he does end up moving in the future. If you're unfamiliar with our mini-series, this is not podcast available, only available right here on the Fantasy Focused YouTube channel. You can find us on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and Facebook as well, Fantasy Focused. Longer versions of our entire list of the wide receiver busts from 2021 in fantasy football can be provided on our podcast anywhere the Believe Podcast Network are heard at the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast. Bob and I have 4 mini-series for wide receivers. If you missed our running backs, dial back on the channel here and you can catch those breakouts, busts, and steals as well. Today, though, we're talking again Calvin Ridley. Huge talent. Obviously, had high hopes when Julio Jones left Tennessee last year. Calvin only played a couple of games, left for personal reasons, did not return. We'll see what happens. Bob, of course, per usual, is going to break down what we saw in 2021, and then I will recap my version of that as well and look ahead to 2022. Bob, great to have you. Let's get cooking.
Yeah, man. So the purpose of these shows are basically to help us how to avoid drafting a bust or how to find a steal. In this case, this week we're doing wide receiver busts, and essentially we're looking at each individual bust situation, whether it was injury or their play on the field or a quarterback situation, and to see what things we could have identified preseason or during the season or whatever it is to help us in 2022. So the guy we're talking about today is Calvin Ridley. You just brought up this guy was highly touted. Positional ADP was 5th overall for wide receivers, 19th overall amongst all players. So that's firmly in the second round. He finishes not only because he finishes outside the top 100 overall, but even on a points per game basis, which is really hard to believe, he was 30th. Like, this guy wasn't even a wide receiver 2 in points per game this season. And there's a lot of factors going into this. And I know when we talk Calvin Ridley, we want to just give him a clean slate going into 2022. And one of the biggest things I always talk about is system continuity. And I bring this up all the time. And I say passing games, especially, actually only passing games really, take a year. We've seen it with Aaron Rodgers. He's been a back-to-back MVP. And the first season with Matt LaFleur was meh. And I'm just saying that it takes time for passing games. And that's exactly what I think happened here. Matt Ryan comes in, new system with Arthur Smith, and it impacts Calvin Ridley. Plus, they have Kyle Pitts. More attention on Ridley because there's no Julio Jones, and Kyle Pitts is a rookie. I expect those things to develop in the second year, so there's a lot of optimism. But here's the key factors for Calvin Ridley. It wasn't an injury. It wasn't because he just stopped playing. His numbers truly dipped this season. His yards per touch this season, and yards per touch is essentially reception, but they do have some running carries here, was 9.1 yards per touch. Prior to this season, it was 13.5. So that's a drop off of nearly 4.5 yards per touch, touchdowns per touch. His career average was 11.5 prior to this season. It dropped all the way to 6.5. That's almost in half of what he's used to catching touchdowns per touch. And finally, what does that equal? Points per touch. 1.79 was his points per touch this season. Prior to this year, it was 2.5. So we saw these numbers completely crater. And it really impacted his consistency. He only played 5 games. He had no elite games. And for wide receivers, that's 18.7 or better. He had 1 wide receiver 1 performance, which was 55th amongst all wide receivers. That's 13 points and a half point PPR. And he had 3 of his 5 games, which is actually pretty good, which made him 13th. He did have a high floor in wide receiver 3 games, my apologies, 10.3 points per game. So essentially double-digit fantasy point performances, half his game. So he did have a high floor, but he didn't have that big-time ceiling. So off the air, Sky, you did lead this up. You said, this made me real sad. So talk about some sadness. We want to hear about the sadness. What made you so sad about Calvin Ridley, and do you think he bounces back in 2022?
Oh boy. So there's a lot of layers to the onion here. First of all, on like a personal level, I don't know what's going on with Calvin Ridley. Nobody seems to know yet. If he's got some mental health issues or need to step the game for personal reasons, I'm rooting for the guy. We all deal with our own things. He's leaving the game that he loves to deal with his own personal stuff. I hope he's doing well. And I just kind of feel for him on that level. For me, being selfish as a fantasy person and a football fan, it made me sad because Calvin Ridley is one of my favorite young talents in the NFL. Love him on the Falcons, loved him and Julio when they were healthy together. And when he left, just like everyone else in the industry, I figured Ridley's going to go off. Bob, last year, I had to pull up last year's notes just to make sure that I loved him as much as I thought that I did. And guess what? I certainly did. Last year, I had him as my wide receiver 4 heading in. You mentioned that, ECR and ADP had him at wide receiver 5. I had him a notch higher than that. So I'm going to dial back a little bit. I'll try to blast through these because I have put these on this podcast before, but it's been a year. So quickly, why I was so high on Calvin Ridley and why I believe that he could get back to that top 5 potential in the right system moving forward if he's okay. He was first in air yards in 2020, 2,063 air yards, completed air yards, deep targets with 40, unrealized air yards. Love that stat for Dweez. He was first across the board in all of those categories in 2020 with Julio Jones, right? He had Dave Ragone coming in as the OC from Chicago. Nothing special, but like a new mix-up. Arthur Smith, as you mentioned, from Tennessee, right? In the 8 games that he had without Julio Jones in 2020, he averaged 11 targets, 7 receptions, 107 yards, and a half of a touchdown. 20 PPR fantasy points. That was wide receiver 4. According to reception perception, which is, one of the best metrics you can use, of course, from Matt Harmon in wide receiver production, he separates on 95% of his routes in both man and zone. Calvin Ridley is absolutely phenomenal. He has 26 touchdowns before last year in 44 career games, 60% chance of him scoring a touchdown per game. Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, and Calvin Ridley pretty much have about that 60 to 64%. So that's the company he keeps if you forgot how incredible Calvin Ridley is and can be. Now, you fast forward to last year, of course. He only played 5 games. And if you look at those 5 games, Bob already gave you the rundown of how, kind of poor it was and he wasn't matching career numbers and all that, even before he missed out on the 5 games. So even the 5 games you had him, because I drafted him everywhere. If I didn't get a running back in the first round or the back of the first, early second, it was probably Calvin Ridley. So I got burned on this quite a bit. The problem was, even in the 5 games he was there, it's not like he was amazing and then left. He wasn't very productive there either. The biggest stat here, of course, his yards and his targets and everything else are down because he didn't play much. But the biggest issue I have is his longest reception in 5 games was just 22 yards. Last year, his longest reception was 63, 36 before that, 75-yard bomb his rookie year. 10 touchdowns, 7 touchdowns, 9 touchdowns, just 2 in 5 games. So not only was he affecting you because he didn't play long-term, but even in the 5 games that he did play, he's a marquee name where you have to play him, and you started him every single week, and he often let you down, unfortunately. So there's a lot of disappointment with Calvin Ridley. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt in football terms. If he comes back to Atlanta as the team as is plus Calvin Ridley, I am probably all in, but he's going to be probably like, in that like 8 to 10 range for wide receivers, not top 4. If he moves teams, we're just going to have to start from scratch and figure that out. But look, I mean, do they bring a running back in? Does Matt Ryan still have it? Was the absence of Julio actually hurting Calvin Ridley versus helping him that we all thought it was going to do? As a strong number 2 versus a number 1. Second year with Arthur Smith and Dave Ragone, is that going to help him in that offense because he was away from the team? Does Russell Gage stick around and have another option there? Does Patterson go back to wide receiver if they bring a running back in? Kyle Pitts obviously taking a jump, as you mentioned. So many question marks for Calvin Ridley. Obviously a bust because of where you drafted him in the first or second round. But you have to really look at like how incredible the player is before he left. That is what I'm trying to hang my hat on as long as I can so far. Bob, am I kind of grasping at straws here, hanging on to the past too much? Or are you with me if he can come back to a similar situation?
Oh, I'm with you 100%, man. I'm talking, and this is what I always talk about. This is going to be the second year leap. I basically had a whole series about this, and the passing game in the second year is where we see the biggest jump in production for passing games in a new system. and you're going to get the discount on Ridley. Early best ball 10 ADP, which is super early. I know that, but he's at 45th overall. So you're going to get him in the 4th round. I am taking Ridley all day there. If he comes back to Atlanta, they run it back with Matt Ryan. They have Kyle Pitts in his 2nd year. I believe that they're going to bring in a better running back. I think that that's going to be huge for this team. The question comes, Russell Gage is a free agent. Who's going to be the wide receiver 2? Do they draft another kid? I don't know. But if he's back on this team, I'm buying it. Now, when it comes to 2022 outlook and potential bust, I like to bring up the fact that there's about 7 or 8 teams that are going to have new OCs. The Bears, the Broncos, the Texans, Jags, Raiders, Dolphins, Vikings, Giants. And on that list, the only elite wide receiver is Justin Jefferson. Now, Justin Jefferson has been awesome, but this is going to be a relatively newer system. Good news is that it is a West Coast scheme. Kevin O'Connell knows Kirk Cousins from their time at Washington Commanders, so there is a little bit of familiarity there, so that maybe the passing game can get up to a hotter start. But when you're looking at that, that's like the only guy. Maybe Jerry Jeudy. The Broncos have way too many weapons. Another name on this bust list is both Jeudy and Sutton, ironically enough, because they have too many guys. So I think if I'm looking at 2022 potential, guys to maybe fade a little bit, it's going to be a guy on a new offense with a new system, because it's going to take time for that team to launch off. Any other thoughts about Calvin Ridley before we go, Sky? You're on mute, buddy.
Thank you. I just want to mention, quickly, I generally, for the running backs, wide receivers is a little bit tougher because you're talking about 3, 4 guys. Generally, you kind of include some tight ends in this mix. So it's a little bit harder to say, like, who's going to be the Calvin Ridley of last year. And now, of course, we don't want 5 games and then leaving our fantasy teams. But talent-wise, coming out of 2020 into the expectation that we had in 2021 for Calvin Ridley, if I had a player comp right now, which is very early in the system, but if I had a player comp right now, Bob, I'm actually going to go with Darnell Mooney, who I loved last year coming in. Rookie season, he did well. Last year, he was getting drafted as the wide receiver 51. I had him way before that. Just, again, a couple comps for him. Ran a 4.38, 10th in unrealized air yards, 11th in deep ball targets, with a mix of, Andy Dalton and Fields. 25% of his targets were deemed uncatchable, right? So if he's able to get better, it's better work. And again, this one is really like storyline. As you mentioned, new OC, new head coach, new system for Darnell Mooney and Fields. Allen Robinson most likely going to leave Chicago. So Darnell Mooney could become that default number 1. And there's not a lot of extra talent around him yet to take away those targets. Calvin Ridley had a similar situation last year until Cordero Patterson became the face of the team. And Kyle Pitts was drafted, obviously. So Darnell Mooney is not Calvin Ridley yet, but I think he has the potential to be. And so he's going to be my player comp heading into 2022. Darnell Mooney could potentially be Calvin Ridley eventually, and somebody that I think still you can get drafted in the middle rounds, and I'll take that upside all day.
All right, man. I know we have a quick new update about one of our sponsors, Bet Online. And you're on mute again, bud.
I apologize. I'll just come off. I'll get the Bet Online for the next one, y'all. Appreciate you guys sticking around for us. Bob, always holding it down. Come back with us tonight, this evening, around 9 p.m. Eastern, 9:30 p.m. Eastern. We'll be right back here on YouTube. You can catch us breaking down DK Metcalf of the Seattle Football Sonics, breaking down why he may have been a bust. Was he a bust? I was super high on him. A little bit disappointing. Had some big games. Will Russ be back? We'll talk all about that tonight. Come back with us. For my man, Bobby LaMarco, I am Sky Guasco. We'll catch you next time.